Imagine an island where ships arriving in Venice were subjected to quarantine, where medical facilities operated for generations, and where today the abandoned buildings have become the center of one of Italy's most famous ghost stories. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But here is the strange part. Much of Poveglia's dark reputation comes from real history, while some of its most frightening stories have never been reliably documented. This is Poveglia, a small island in the Venetian lagoon, located between Venice and Lido. But was it really cursed? Or did centuries of isolation, disease, abandonment, and storytelling create the perfect haunted island legend? And what about the plague victims, the mysterious doctor and that old campanile? By the end, the creepiest part may not be the ghosts. Before we get to the legends, we need to understand why Poveglia became such a strange place. Historical records trace the island's history back to the 5th century. Over the centuries, it developed into an inhabited community, and by the 14th century it had become a significant settlement. But during the War of Chioggia between Venice and Genoa, which lasted from 1378 to 1381, the island's population was displaced, and Poveglia's civilian role changed dramatically. The island was later used for military and health-related purposes. Its location in the Venetian lagoon made it useful for controlling movement toward Venice. More importantly, from the late 18th century onward, Poveglia became part of Venice's system for controlling infectious disease. The island was used as a quarantine station and was connected with the city's efforts to contain epidemics. Official descriptions of the island also identify a lazaretto, or quarantine facility, established there in the late 18th century. Then came another chapter. During the 20th century, the island's buildings were used for healthcare, including a geriatric hospital, or long-term care facility. The geriatric hospital closed in 1968, and the island subsequently fell into prolonged neglect. And that is where history begins to merge with legend. So, what happens when an island already associated with quarantine, disease, and abandonment is left almost completely unused? For centuries, Poveglia has been connected with Venice's efforts to control epidemics. But this is where we need to be careful, because one of the biggest claims about the island is also one of the least reliable. You will often hear that 100,000 or even 160,000 plague victims died on Poveglia, and that their remains were buried or burned across the island. Those numbers are repeated constantly in popular articles, videos, and paranormal stories. But there is no solid historical evidence establishing those figures, and Poveglia per tutti explicitly rejects the idea that Poveglia was a mass grave containing those enormous numbers of plague victims. So we should not present 100,000 or 160,000 as fact. What we can say with confidence is that Poveglia was genuinely part of Venice's quarantine and public health system, and that Venice experienced devastating epidemics. The island's association with disease is therefore real, even if the enormous body count stories are not. And honestly, that history is disturbing enough. Imagine being separated from the city because officials feared you might be carrying a deadly disease. Venice could be visible across the water, yet you were still isolated from the people and places you knew. Over generations, that kind of isolation creates a powerful association with death and fear. And once a place develops that reputation, every abandoned building, every strange sound, and every unexplained story can become part of something much bigger. But if disease created the first layer of fear, what happened when the island became a medical facility? Now we reach the second mystery, and this is where the popular story becomes much darker. Poveglia's medical history is real. The island continued to have healthcare-related functions into the 20th century, and its later facility is often described online as a psychiatric asylum. But that description is misleading. According to Poveglia per tutti, the island's later institution was a geriatric sanatorium rather than a psychiatric asylum. The organization's historical account says that Poveglia served important health functions from 1782 until 1968. The state property agency also describes the surviving buildings primarily as hospital pavilions, constructed between 1900 and 1945. So, where did the famous asylum story come from? This is where things get interesting. Popular paranormal accounts tell the story of a cruel doctor who supposedly performed horrific experiments or lobotomies on patients. According to the legend, the doctor eventually became tormented by what he had done and either jumped or fell from the island's campanile. It sounds almost too perfect. A mysterious doctor, an abandoned medical facility, an old tower, and a terrible ending. But there is no reliable historical evidence establishing that story as fact. So here comes the twist. The island does not need the doctor story to be frightening. Its documented history already gives us quarantine facilities, healthcare buildings, decades of abandonment, and a location deeply connected to Venice's efforts to control infectious disease. The legend appears to have grown around those real historical elements, and that distinction matters. A mystery becomes more interesting, not less, when we separate what we know from what people later imagined. But then comes the question that keeps Poveglia's reputation alive. If the famous doctor story cannot be established as historical fact, why does the island still have such a powerful reputation for being haunted? That takes us to the third mystery. Imagine standing near Poveglia's abandoned buildings today. Weathered walls rise behind thick vegetation. Old hospital structures show decades of neglect. Windows are broken or covered with vegetation, and the island is surrounded by the quiet waters of the Venetian lagoon. There is no normal city traffic, no busy street outside, no constant crowd, just silence. Now add the history. For a place already associated with quarantine and medical care, an abandoned hospital complex is almost designed to trigger the imagination, and this is where one particular structure becomes important, the old campanile. The tower has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Poveglia's haunted reputation. Popular stories connect it to the alleged doctor and his supposed death, but again, we have to separate the legend from the evidence. The State Property Agency describes the historic campanile as belonging to the former Church of San Vitale and notes that it was later adapted as a lighthouse. There is no reliable evidence in the sources examined here establishing the dramatic supernatural story surrounding the tower. Still, the tower survives as a symbol, and that brings us back to the mystery we teased at the beginning. Maybe Poveglia does not have one single curse at all. Maybe it has layers, disease created. Fear, isolation created silence, abandonment created atmosphere, and later stories connected all of those things into one supernatural narrative. Stories of ghosts, screams, strange feelings, and paranormal encounters have helped build Poveglia's reputation, especially through popular media and paranormal storytelling. But are those experiences evidence of ghosts? No reliable scientific evidence establishes that. There are also ordinary explanations for some experiences in abandoned places. Empty buildings can create unusual acoustics. Wind can move through broken windows and corridors. Sounds can travel across water. And when people already know that a location is supposed to be haunted, ambiguous sounds and sensations can easily be interpreted through that expectation. But here's the strange thing. Even if every ghost story disappeared tomorrow, Poveglia would still be one of the most unsettling places in the Venetian lagoon. Why? Because its real history is enough to make your imagination do the rest. And there is one more question. Why did nobody simply turn the island into a normal modern development? The answer is less supernatural and more complicated. Poveglia spent decades in a state of neglect, while different proposals for its future came and went. But in 2025, something important changed. Italy's State Property Agency granted the northern undeveloped part of Poveglia to the association Poveglia per Tutti under a 6-year concession. The association plans to develop that area as a lagoon urban park, with an emphasis on biodiversity, green space, research, and community use. But there is an important detail here. This does not mean the entire island has been restored or open to visitors. The built-up part of Poveglia remains under the management of the State Property Agency, and current access to that developed section is prohibited. The northern part, which does not contain the main abandoned buildings, is the portion under concession to Poveglia per Tutti. Think about that for a second. The island's future may have nothing to do with ghosts. It may be about reclaiming a place that has been defined for generations by fear and abandonment. And there is something almost poetic about that. A place remembered online as one of the world's most haunted islands could gradually become a place for nature, research, community activities, and public life. But that forces us to ask a harder question. How much of Poveglia's terrifying reputation actually comes from its documented history, and how much was created by the stories told about it? And that brings us to the real mystery of Poveglia. Was it cursed? There is no reliable evidence that a supernatural curse exists. The famous stories about enormous numbers of plague victims, a sadistic doctor, horrific experiments, and paranormal activity should be treated carefully because they are repeated far more often than they are historically documented. But something else is undeniably real. Poveglia was inhabited for centuries. Its residents were displaced during the War of Chioggia. The island later became part of Venice's military and health infrastructure. It was used for quarantine and medical purposes, and its geriatric hospital eventually closed in 1968. After that, the island entered decades of neglect. Over time, those real events created the perfect foundation for a legend. So maybe Poveglia is not the world's most cursed island because ghosts live there. Maybe it became cursed because human history gave it everything a ghost story needs: fear, suffering, isolation, silence, and unanswered questions. And honestly, that version is creepier because you don't need to invent the darkness. History already left it there. If you enjoyed this mystery, subscribe to Mystery Stories 365 and comment. What should we investigate next? A haunted island, a vanished city, or an unsolved mystery? Like the video, and I'll see you in the next story.